Well, as Rachel said, my name's Tim, and Rachel and I had just had the blessed opportunity to come out and be part of the leadership team here for probably about the past month. This is my second week teaching out here. Hopefully not my last. I guess we'll see how it goes. But speaking of the leadership team, I am just stupid blessed, maybe is the word I would use, that I get to serve alongside the Moores, Tani and Jason, and then Austin and Maddie. Turns out that their anniversaries are within a week of each other. So Tani and Jason celebrated 25 years last Wednesday. I think that deserves a round of applause. And on the 14th, Austin and Maddie get to celebrate 2 years of marriage, which also deserves a round of applause. So I just want to pray for them real quick, pray over them because, marriage is a powerful thing. And, just want to pray for those four. Father God, we thank you so much for Jason, Tani, Austin, Maddie, God. Lord, I pray that you be with them as they are able to just pour into each other, connect with each other, God. Just strengthen them as they pour into this church and this community. Just use us to encourage them and build them up. We thank you and we love you. Amen. So we are into Romans 11, a pretty fun passage to study. I personally think our big idea, and you'll hear that a lot. The big idea, and essentially that would be the one thing that I would love for you guys to take away from the message. It's just the one thing. And the big idea today is that our response to God's mercy has been something that we've been talking about for quite a while in Romans. Our response to God's mercy must be complete trust in God's plan. Response to God's mercy, complete trust in God's plan. I think a lot of us are quick to do the whole trust, like, oh, I trust you. But what we're really saying is like, I trust you with 40 to 80% of this, but that last 20% I'm going to hold on to because I don't trust you in that. So complete trust. Now, to kick things off, I'm going to dig into Star Wars 8. How many Star Wars fans do we have here? Awesome, a few. Okay, so I can lie and make stuff up and no one's going to be the wiser. But we're going to look into Star Wars 8, and what's happening is the good guys, who are called the Resistance, they're on this big ship because all their other ships have gotten destroyed. And the last of the Resistance is on this ship, about 400 people. Bad guys are following them, and they are kind of firing on the ship. A lot of the leadership has died in the attacks, so the lady who has now taken over is Vice Admiral Holdo is her name, and she's decided, all right, evacuation. We're going to get everyone on small ships. We're going to send them to a planet that is safe. Well, there's this trigger-happy soldier named Poe, who's one of the main kind of characters in the storyline, and he's upset. He sees that as cowardly. He wants a decisive move to be made. He wants action. He thinks it's weak and cowardly. He goes to the point where him and some other loyalists to the cause try to take over this lady. And they're on the same team, but he's like, no, you have poor leadership. He tries, things happen, and eventually he doesn't succeed in his takeover of Vice Admiral Holdo. And him and everyone else is forced onto these small evacuation ships, right? And so Holdo's plan is to be on this big ship and maybe even cause a distraction, right? So bad guys don't see the small ships, they just see this big ship. She's like, well, if I can kind of lead them this way, that provides safety. Well, Poe, the angry main character's biggest fears come to reality when the bad guys realize what's happening and they see the small ships and they start attacking the small ships. And that's what he was afraid of. He's like, oh, that's literally what I was afraid of. And then Vice Admiral's complete plan, what she was planning or what she did, comes into fruition when you got bad guys, good guys, and she's going that way. She ends up turning her ship around, and it's just her on this big ship. And then she basically hits the accelerator, hits the gas, and instead of running away or fleeing and saving herself, she sends her ship into the bad guy's ship. Complete sacrifice, destroys the whole enemy fleet that is following them, kills all the bad guys, ruins their plan, and allows the smaller ships to evacuate. Poe, who now kind of realizes what's going on, says, I can't believe she did that, just completely befuddled because he wasn't looking at her overall plan. And one of the other generals looks at him and says, I completely understand why she did that, because her overall plan wasn't for her to escape. It was to provide safety and an ultimate rescue for the people in her care. You could probably guess where this is going, but I wonder how many of us can relate to, unfortunately, not the heroic leader that sacrificed themselves, how many of us can relate to this character, Poe, though, right? Not only frustrated with God's plan for us when it seems to be playing out the way we didn't want, okay? And not only relating to him by not understanding the plan, that's me, just kind of in a general state of confusion, but sometimes I feel like I full on try to take the reins from God, right? Like, hey, God, I know you're big almighty. Like, you literally have a book that is a testament to how, like, awesome you are, but I got this one, right? Like, we do that time and time again. And I feel like it's almost me in my actions saying, hey, God, I know you're right. I just want to prove me wrong, right? Like, I'm doing you a favor. I'm proving me wrong. I feel like that's what my actions are sometimes. So, again, a response to God's mercy, what he's doing is complete trust in his overall plan. We're going into chapter 11, and there's a few really deep, I guess you could say, dense concepts in chapter 11. I'm going to pause and take a shameless plug for a podcast that we at River Valley do. It's called Digging Deeper. It's a midweek podcast, and what that allows us as our teaching team to do is allow the teachers to teach on, kind of gently touch on these topics, but then go into those topics literally deeper. So you're going to maybe hear me address some of these, and if you would like a deeper look into some of the topics that surround chapter 11, that's comes out on Wednesday evening, and it's just a great opportunity for the congregation to dig deeper into some of this text. So, again, complete trust in God's big overall plan. Louis Giglio, he's this Christian teacher, pastor, a great communicator. He, a few years ago, he went on tour with Chris Tomlin, and they called it the Indescribable Tour, right? Chris Tomlin sings a song, Indescribable, and he goes, and he basically talks about how big God is, right? So he uses outer space, and he uses this cool example, and I don't know if I'm hitting on it exactly right, but basically there's this big projector screen, let's call it 15 by 15 feet, and he talks about the biggest star that we know of in outer space at the time. It's called Canis Majoris, and kind of a graphic of it is a complete circle on this screen. And he says, this is how big God is, and this is how big God's creation is. He grabs a Sharpie, and he says, I couldn't use the pinpoint of this Sharpie. I couldn't go on this screen and put a dot that would be accurate to scale the size of our sun in comparison to this star. So if you have this big star on a screen and there's a tiny Sharpie dot, that wouldn't be an accurate scale of how big that star is compared to our sun. Now, while the crowd's just sitting there like with their brains melting out of their ears, he says, guys, I don't want you to realize, or I don't want you to think that you are small. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I want you to realize how small we actually are. And how I would tag that is how small we are and how big and powerful our God is. So, again, I just want to address the fact that there are some things regarding God, regarding Scripture, that we have to understand, that we have to commit our lives to as Christians so that we can fully and functionally move forward. Because sometimes if I don't maybe commit to trusting God all the way, I'm really just kind of in a stall and don't realize it. And I'm operating out of this stall. So we need to commit and kind of, again, functionally move forward by understanding this stuff. So 3 things we must understand. I'm going to give you all my points just straightforward, and we're going to go through them. 1, we must understand God's plan. That's his sovereignty and salvation. We must understand God's ability. He can use both people and person, individuals and groups. And number 3, we must understand God's mercy, both kind and severe. So there's a few times we're going to go through some big chunks of text I'm going to read through. I ask you to just power along with me, follow along in your Bible. I believe it's on the screen. We're going to start with the first 11 verses of chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1 through 11. There's a lot of ones on that, but we're good. So verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. Now, real quick, I don't think that's like, has God rejected the nation of Israel? No. That's like, of course not. I think that's a fist on the table. He's like very passionate. Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he chose from the very beginning. Do you realize what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Do you remember God's reply, verse 4? He said, no, I have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal. It is the same today, for a few of the people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, his undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. So this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. As scriptures say, God has put them in a deep sleep. To this day he has shut their eyes so they do not see, and closed their ears so they do not hear. Likewise, David said, let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap that makes them think all is well. Let their blessings cause them to stumble, and let them get what they deserve. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and let their backs be bent forever. Verse 11, did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But he wanted his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. So one of the questions, kind of the point of tension here, surrounds the identity of Israel. And there's essentially kind of two Israels we're talking about. Ethnic Israel, the people that are born into the nation of Israel, the Israelites, right? They are people of Israel. Then there's spiritual Israel, the church, the chosen, the elect, the predestined. So there's a few different views on these types of Israels. I'm going to address those real quick. Again, these are like the big words, the big long isms and stuff that would be addressed on our podcast, but I want to go over them just to kind of understand the tension that surrounds this text. So the first view is that says that the church, spiritual Israel, is distinct from ethnic Israel. God has two peoples, two plans, an earthly plan and a spiritual plan. An earthly plan for Israel and a spiritual plan for the church. They are separated. This term is called dispensationalism, okay? Not a word that you're going to probably hear a lot. The second view says that the church, spiritual Israel, replaces ethnic Israel. God has always only had one people. The church replaces Israel for this privilege. Of course, Israel can join the party, but they have to come to the church just like any other country or person. This technical term would be called covenantal or reformed theology. And the third view, which is probably where I personally would place my camp for the time being, is that the church isn't separate from Israel, nor does the church replace Israel, but the church is the expansion of Israel. So again, what's happening and the tension and the reason why the Israelites are upset and why Paul is addressing this is because ethnic Israel is not trusting God's overall plan. Remember, he said, you are my people, and now other people are invited to the party, and they're frustrated, they're concerned. So they're not trusting the overall picture while they're in this smaller picture that ain't necessarily looking too fresh for them right now. And they're questioning, like, did God reject us? What's happening? This kind of reminds me, how many football fans do we have in here? Or people that acknowledge that football? Okay, so Super Bowl 51, okay, was the Patriots-Falcons, one of the more intriguing Super Bowls, right? Tom Brady, he's, can't be stopped, blah, 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 right? So imagine before Super Bowl 51, somebody, and I mean, for the sake of the story, let's say God comes to you and says, hey, the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl, right? You can take that to the bank. So God tells you that, and you're like, well, I'll take that to the bank, right? So you live your life like they're going to win the Super Bowl. You talk like they're going to win the Super Bowl. You make a lot of bold claims that they are going to win the Super Bowl. So now you're watching the Super Bowl, and if you're not familiar with football, football has 4 quarters, 15 minutes long, right? So at the end of the second quarter, it's halfway through, big halftime show, blah, blah, blah. Then you have the second half. So you're confident that the Patriots are going to win this game. You are stoked. So you're watching the game. It's midway through the third quarter, and you see this score on the scoreboard, right? It's almost near the end of the third quarter, and it is 28-3, bad guys if you're a Patriots fan, right? So you're just like, God told me that the Patriots are going to win, and this is what's going on. And you are not anymore affirmed when it's a little later in the game and you see this score, 28-12. Now we only got 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Now you're kind of getting worried. You're sweating a little bit. You're like, listen, the game's almost over. That's not a lot of time in football word, right? So now there's a minute left. You see this score where it's 28-20. You're like, there's 1 minute left. Like, God told me that they were going to win, and they are losing. Right? And by the way, they're the NE. They're the New England Patriots. So you're frustrated, But man, wouldn't you be dramatically surprised when you stay for the full game and you see this score, the end of the game, 34-28. It is as God said, and they won the game. Now, God did not make any of that claims to me, by the way, but this represents some of the concerns that Paul is addressing. Because the Israelites are like, did God reject ethnic Israel? Because it's the middle of the third quarter and it is not looking so hot. It is 28-3. Like, we are not living our best life over here. So they're frustrated. But Paul is reminding them, he's actually reminding all parties, like, guys, the game is not over. Like, this isn't the final score. Go back and play the game. Like, we're playing the game. Go back to it. So we're going to look at this timeline of kind of what's happening, kind of maybe the past, the present, and their mind, and then their future. And what we're looking at first is Israel's transgression. So in verse 7, it says, so this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God that they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones that God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. So ethnic Israel, right, the Israelites had many generations of traditions and law following, right? They were following the law. They sought to uphold the law, and the majority kind of fell into their own righteousness. They stuck to what they knew, what they could control. So at the end of the day, it was, are they putting their trust in what they can do or what God can do? And they chose what they can do. But spiritual Israel, the elect, they found what they desired, and that was God's grace. Those were the ones that understood God's grace as a gift. Tim Keller, somebody who was, his books and his insight on this were very influential to our teaching team as we were preparing for this. He says, Israel sought the righteousness of God. When confronted with receiving it through works or as a gift, the majority chose works, while spiritual Israel chose to receive the gift. I think that kind of puts it in a great context for us to understand. So this now hardened the hearts of majority of Israel. And a hardened person is someone who just fails to comprehend the understanding of the gospel as a free justification and adoption. So they failed to understand that, and they, again, wanted to take more responsibility than they should. So that's Israel's transgression. We move to Israel's envy in verse 11. It says, did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But he wanted his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. And we hear words like envy, and we automatically correlate that with sin, right? Because I think the nature of envy correlates to what we are envious of. And in our human worlds, I'm very used to, I am jealous of something or I'm envious of something. I make that as an idol in my life, and now that is a sin that I am putting this or the pursuit of this above God. But that is not necessarily the case. And so what Paul is wanting the Gentiles to do is experience and live in God's grace in a way that the Israelites, whose hearts are hard, look at that and they say, man, I want that, or better yet, I need that. So he's wanting the Gentiles to just live in God's grace and really just show that through their lives and the true meaning of salvation, so where the Israelites are aware of what they need. I kind of think of it like a spotlight, right? So the spotlight was on the Israelites. Boom, awesome, everyone's in darkness. And now the spotlight has moved to the Gentiles. And the Israelites, the ones whose heart are heart, they're like, oh man, it's dark. Like, I'm tripping over myself. Like, I need the light. I need Christ's salvation. Take a quick pause and let's do some life application. And so maybe a tough question to ask ourselves, but does our community, does our River Valley community, does our River Valley Rogue River community, does your family, your Christian family, do we live in a way where people outside this community look at that and they're like, that is something that I want. It is something that I need, right? I'm kind of going through my life and I was like, probably not, right? If they watched that confrontation or they heard that joke, like, I don't think they're necessarily seeing that they're missing out on something. But it's a good question to ask ourselves. Does our way that we live stir up this desire for that in other people's life outside of our community? So again, God has hardened the hearts of ethnic Israel to open the door for the Gentiles, so that ultimately the Israelites will see his mercy and come back to him. So that's God's overall plan, where they're not necessarily privy to all of that. And this leads to the question of Israel's future. Verse 1 of chapter 11 kicks off with, has God rejected Israel? No. Paul uses a few arguments very briefly. The first argument, he uses himself, a Jew, right? He says, hey guys, God has not rejected us because, well, I'm here and I'm a key cog to what God is doing. So he said, he has not rejected you because I am here and I am one of you. Another argument that he uses is that election, again, that God foreordained, like God called his shot a long time ago. He predestined this, and this little hiccup that we're in right now doesn't change what he did. He uses Elijah. Elijah's a Bible character that I am very entertained by as you read his story, and this conversation with him is that there's always been a faithful Israel. There's always been a spiritual Israel that's part of ethnic Israel. And the mistake that Elijah made is that all of Israel has been rejected. But in fact, there's this remnant that is chosen by grace. And Paul says that there was always this remnant because God's grace is and will be always on display. There's never a time where God's like, nope, grace completely cut off. So again, this was God's plan all along, was to display his grace, to display his love, and to display his mercy. But here the Israelites are, and I think sometimes in our life, we're here in the fourth quarter and the score is not going our way, and it just leads us to start questioning his faithfulness to us. But God is putting his sovereignty on full display, doing something that the Israelites, and even in our lives, something that we have trouble comprehending. So that was number one. That was a big one, but we must understand God's plan, his sovereignty, and his salvation. And it's important to remember to focus on his big plan and not prioritize or idolize our small goals, to prioritize his big plan. Number two is to understand God's abilities. That God can use both person and people, big groups of people. As I had mentioned last week in my message, one thing I used to justify my spiritual laziness, what I would call it, kind of like God's telling me to do something and I'm just like, well, right? And so we have those arguments. And so one of my arguments, poor arguments, is that like there are just so many people that are better at what I do than me, right? So why would God want me to teach when we could get, like I said, that pastor Tim Keller, we could just blast him on the YouTubes and you guys would get so much more out of him. Or for evangelism, like just keep Billy Graham alive forever because he was awesome. Like just keep letting him do him. Why use somebody like me when there's far more effective people? I love Rachel and I love her worship, but like there's like Bethel and Hillsong out there. Why not get them on the YouTubes? And that could be our worship. Like why use, individual people like Rachel or Fran and get big fans of them? Or I think, you want somebody that's going through a hard time to like talk to me? Like that's cool, but we have a Tawny. Like, just let's clone Tawny and make a bunch of Tawnies because Tawny is far. Yeah, well, let's clap for Tawny. Sure, that works. Yeah. So again, I use that, but Paul, his reminder is that God can use anyone. I think of Hebrews 11, which is kind of dubbed the Hall of Faith. Basically, just a lot of people that kicked butt in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and they call it the Hall of Faith. And I was looking through that list the other day, and I was kind of blown away because what is that list filled with? That is filled with doubters, people with insecurities, adulterers, murderers, and like literally a prostitute. But these are people that let God work in their heart and that they understood God's overall plan and what he was doing, and they trusted him because they were presented with opportunities where it's like, all right, somebody of the Lord was sent to you. You either go with what you know and what you feel comfortable with and say like, peace, I'm out, I'm not doing this, or you understand that God's got a bigger plan and you go with that. And these people chose that. So I think of David, right? We're all familiar, David and Goliath, like he's this shepherd. And I'm guessing he had two really good skills, herding sheep and rolling with a slingshot, right? And I can't think of anything except like a slingshot competition, which that would generally be useful. But yet God uses somebody with those skills to slay Goliath, right? Somebody that was causing fear over the Israelites. Ultimately, he had a heart that was willing to serve and defend and fight for God, and he trusted him, and his slingshot did the work. I think of Elijah, who was mentioned earlier. Like, you talk about somebody who's fiery and passionate. This was a guy, and I almost feel like we as humans can relate to him really well because he was just kind of a little bit of an arrogance and a little sarcastic, and he went up against 400 prophets of Baal. So he's in this disagreement. And I'm sitting here, if I was talking to a room of 400 people and I knew that everyone agreed with me, I would still have a level of intimidation or fear. He is in this showdown with 400 people that disagree with him, and whoever loses, it's not going to go well for them. But he has complete confidence in what God is doing. And I love in his story because, they do their thing, and what the prophets of Baal try to do, it doesn't work. And so it's his turn to shine, and he has this really real conversation with God. It's like, I know you're going to do what you're going to do, so do it right now and let it happen. And he just has full confidence in God's plan. I think of groups. So those were individuals. I think of groups of people. I think of the walls of Jericho, a group of people walking around walls, knocking it down at God's order. I think of literally the Jews and Gentiles that we're talking about right now. How God uses the stubborn ways of them. And these aren't people that are just willing to do whatever, right? They are stubborn and they are set in their ways. But he uses the disobedience of the Israelites to open the door for the inclusion of the Gentiles. Does it in there, he swings it back around to bring back in his people. He uses these groups of people, and he uses their weaknesses and their strengths, which is something that we don't think about. We think of, how can my strengths be used? Nope, God's just going to go ahead and press us and use their weaknesses as well. I can't talk about God using people without talking about the main man, and that's Jesus. And I'm blown away that, again, the people, when they were expecting a Messiah, they're expecting this warrior king, a fierce, Gerard Butler-like man that's just strong and mighty. And they're expecting this warrior king, and they get a servant to fill the warrior king's shoes. The servant Jesus comes, and ultimately he defeats more evil than a warrior ever could. Right? He uses Jesus to display this perfect combination of justice, of love, of mercy, of power in a way that could never be matched by anyone or anything, individual or group alike. So something to remember is that God doesn't need people. God doesn't need people who want or need to be heroes, right? He doesn't need people or to use people that just want to be heroes. He can use anyone, use people that are willing. More importantly, these people had a full grasp or understanding of what God is, who he is, and what he was doing. So I know for me, I have to forfeit the idea that it's through my work and what I do where I receive salvation and kind of this affirmation from God. I have to forfeit that idea because it's complete trust in him, not in what I can do. And this is where Israel was essentially getting hung up. Again, it's through understanding of his mercy that allows us to do the work in the community that we're in. And this kind of leads us to our last point, understanding God's mercy. It's both kind and severe. I'm going to read about the last 14 or so verses in the section that we're in, starting at verse 17 and going to about 30. So you can bear with me. It's a lot, but it's good stuff, I promise you. Verse 17. But some of these branches from Abraham's tree, some of the people of Israel, have been broken off. And you, Gentiles, who were branches from a wild olive tree, have been grafted in. So now you also receive the blessing God has promised Abraham and his children, sharing in the rich nourishment from the root of God's special olive tree. But you must not brag about being grafted in to replace the branches that were broken off. You are just a branch, not the root. Kind of giving him the hard truth here. Verse 19, he says, well, you may say those branches were broken off to make room for me. Yes, but remember, those branches were broken off because they didn't believe in Christ. And you are there because you do believe. So don't think highly of yourself, but fear what could happen. For if God did not spare the original branch, he won't spare you either. Verse 22, notice how God is both kind and severe. He is severe toward those who disobeyed, but kind to you if you continue to trust in his kindness. But if you stop trusting, you also will be cut off. And if the people of Israel turn from their unbelief, they will be grafted in again, for God has the power to graft them back into the tree. You by nature were a branch cut off from a wild olive tree. So if God was willing to do something contrary to nature by grafting you into his cultivated tree, he will be far more eager to graft the original branches back into the tree where they belong. Verse 25. I want you to understand this mystery, dear brothers and sisters, so that you will not feel proud about yourselves. He's just knocking them right off their high horse right out of the gate. Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will last only until the full number of Gentiles come to Christ. And so all Israel will be saved, as the scriptures say. The one who rescues will come from Jerusalem, and he will turn Israel away from ungodliness. And this is my covenant with them, and I will take away their sins. Final stretch, verse 28. Many of the people of Israel are now enemies of the good news, and this benefits you Gentiles. Yet they are still the people he loves because he chose their ancestors, Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob. For God's gift and his call can never be withdrawn. So that's a lot, but the good news is that Paul uses a really cool analogy, so I don't have to come up with something from another movie like Star Wars, because it's all right here. And what he's saying, he's using this idea of plant grafting, which is a real thing, and it's this technique that essentially will use, cut off one branch from one plant or veggie and attach it to the other so that they will be able to use the nutrients from one another and grow and nourish each other and actually get the best of both worlds. So what he's saying here is that, hey, Israel was cut off due to their unbelief. You are in because you're the wild shoot, so you are kind of the foreign plant that was added in because you do believe. Like, high five to you. But don't forget, I don't think he was much of a finger wagger, but he says, like, Israel will be grafted back in. And if you have unbelief, you will be removed. We see a big swing here because I think a lot of this chapter, and there's a lot of times in Romans, where Paul is gently and not so gently giving the what's what to the Israelites, right? Like really trying to shake them straight and help them to understand what's going on. But we're seeing a gentle reminder of God's power and his sovereignty. Like literally, he is able to do something contrary to nature, and we're seeing that be applied to the Gentiles' mindset as well. I think back to my childhood. Real quick, younger siblings. How many younger siblings do we have? Okay, so a joy that I had as a younger sibling is I got to watch my older siblings get in trouble, right? Sometimes it was by my doing, whether I was ratting them out or, set them up. But I also got to watch them get in trouble, and sometimes I actually got to learn from their mistakes without actually having to do them. But I would sit there and I would watch kind of my mom dispense this punishment on my brother, who's 7 years older than me. So, if I'm 9, he's 16, and I'm watching her just kind of give him the business, right? I got my popcorn. I'm like, this is cool, right? Especially if I was upset at him at that point. But here's the deal, is that if she ever saw me getting proud, kind of like a ha-ha or something, point at him, she would gently and lovingly come to me and say, you are not void of that. Like, if you do what he did, the same thing will happen to you, right? So it's like, don't get any ideas. And so I was like, okay, party's over, right? And here's the thing. My mom's relationship with me and my siblings and her love, it didn't stop at that punishment. She wasn't like, you were late, you broke curfew, you're out, boom, right? She didn't reject my brother because ultimately my mom's plan with her punishments was stemming from love and mercy. She wanted all of us to grow and succeed and understand her love and mercy and then share that love and mercy on people in our lives. So she was giving this because she loved him, and eventually she would have to punish me, and she did that out of love as well. So Paul's using this illustration of bringing these two plants together and kind of the cutting off due to unbelief and the adding in due to belief. He's using this as an illustration that these two plants are getting the best of both worlds, like they're getting the best of each other. I'm doing this to benefit both plants, the best being salvation. So verses 19 and 20 say, well, you may say those branches were broken off to make room for me. Yes, but remember, those branches are there because they didn't believe. There's no and. It's not like a Jesus and. They didn't believe. You are here because you do believe. Don't think highly of yourself, but fear what could happen. So it's like, cool beans. Your spot in this family is due to your belief. That is awesome. Their removal is due to their unbelief. And he's just letting them know what is going on. So God is a loving parent, and Paul, his voice, says, you are not void of this either. You don't escape this. So I want us to remember, last week I talked a lot about our response and our responsibility. I hope that we've hit the hammer on the nail about salvation being in God's work, but our responsibility is real and important. Our belief will then, our full, complete trust will lead to what we are able to do through our lives. And I'm going to reference a few of my favorite verses. 1 John 4:19, very short, very simple, very powerful. We love because he first loved us. Not a long list of reasons why we need to love. We love because he first loved us. So we are loved, so we get to love. And we are saved because he saved us, right? We are not saved because we were awesome or cool or I tell kind of funny jokes. Like, we are saved because he saved us. It's in that we get to share God's love. John 13:35 says, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples, right? Not how you use big words, not how you do this, not how you can do this, but your love that you are sharing to your friends, your family, to people that you oppose. Like, your love will show people that you are a real, true, trusting disciple. So we as Christians, we don't have the ultimate authority, but we do have responsibility. We have responsibility to display God's mercy in our life. We have the responsibility to receive his mercy, and we have the responsibility to understand God's ultimate mercy, and that is that it is kind and severe. A few other verses, Romans 31:2, say now they are rebels, and God's mercy has come to you, so that they too will share in God's mercy. For God has imprisoned everyone in disobedience so that he could have mercy on everyone. So that's his goal. The disobedience is happening so that ultimately we will see his mercy. I recall our time in Romans 9 where we're kind of trying to understand God's election. They say, well, was God unfair because, he displayed mercy on some? And he says, of course not, because God told Moses, I will have mercy on those who I have mercy on. And I think our human tendency, and I shouldn't involve you in this, it might literally just be me out of maybe fear and insecurity, is I think of God like a mean PE teacher, right? Who's kind of picking dodgeball teams. And he's like, all right, all the athletes or all the people that care about dodgeball, can throw dodgeball, you're all on one team. And all the people that don't care about dodgeball or wouldn't call themselves athletes, like, you're on the other team, right? And we have this fear and insecurity that, like, we're on the wrong team. And so we see him as kind of this, mean cat playing cat and mouse. But we got it all wrong. God's ultimate desire is to show his mercy. I mean, in our sin nature, we are destined for a path for hell. Like, that is what we as humans in sin, like, that's what we deserved. So for him to display, to even have another option is so merciful, and it's hard for us to understand. He didn't have to do that at all. We shouldn't even be focused on the fact that the teams are being the way they are. We should be stoked that he is, like, picking teams, right? That it's even happening in the first place. I'm not saying dodgeball and Christianity are alike. However, I stopped to think about it, and there really are, unfortunately, like, a lot of similarities, especially when you think of all the bumps and bruises that we go through, but that's neither here nor there. So verse 22 says, notice how God is both kind and severe. He is severe towards those who disobeyed, but kind to you if you continue to trust in his kindness. If you stop trusting, you also will be cut off. So the verse not only captures God's heart, but it also captures our responsibility. And what it's not saying is like, hey, your Christianity-ness is going to be reviewed annually, and like, we'll see how you're doing, we'll go from there, right? It's not saying, hey, you're like a level 3, we need you at a level 5, right? It's saying trust in his, like, belief. That's what it's about. God is both kind and severe, and he is just to those who disobey. And Israelites lived in a world of just. You did this is going to happen, so you can reconcile that. And now his justice is being displayed, and it's being talked about. But he is kind as you continue to trust. And trust, that's the answer. Have faith. Take the one step knowing he's going to be there, then take the next step. And that's what we need to do in our lives, in our community. And God's not trusting us to, like, he's not wanting us to trust in him so that he can be affirmed that he's a good God. Like, God knows he's a good God. In the beginning in creation, he made what he made, and he said, it is good. Like, he knows he is a good God. But he has provided mercy for everyone. And his desire is that mercy, that love, and that hope is displayed through us, and glory will be shown to all. I'm going to ask Rachel to come back up, and I just kind of want to remind us, again, this is something I'm probably telling myself more than you guys, but we have to have complete faith in God, because he's not a vending machine. Like, I can't walk up and be like, all right, God, I'm totally down for your mercy. That's A2. Like, I don't need your, I don't even want, like, punishment or whatever. Like, I'm not going to get that. I just want this. He is a good, he is kind, and he is severe, and it's a full relationship with God, a full, complete trust that is required as we go through our life. And it's in that full trust where we will experience the fruit that we receive from him and the fruit that we get to share with everyone in our lives. Pray with me. God, on behalf of this family here, I just ask that you give us opportunities, continue to give us opportunities to just trust you, trust your faith, your goodness, your kindness, God. I just thank you so much for bringing me here with this family and what you're doing in all of our lives, Lord. Just use us, willing hearts, just use us to do your work, to show your mercy, to show your love. We thank you so much, God, and we love you. Amen.